Charlie, I was saying, is a member of the California Society, and he is a geographer and a cartographer. And that's, you could talk more about that if you like, Charlie, about how that led to your interest in SAR, but he's done battlefield maps and many others, and that's really a unique skill set. And his presentation this morning is entitled Eggs Benedict. And Charlie, I'm going to let you explain to me how he came up with that title, but I'll let you explain that to our members. So without further ado, Charlie, thank you for joining us. We've got about 30 minutes and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Dick. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and I'll give you a little background on this presentation. So let me get it here, screen, there it goes. And it should share a second time. All right, hopefully all of you can see the screen now. And this was a presentation I ended up first doing for my chapter in Redlands, California. And we traditionally have breakfast during our chapter meeting. So Eggs Benedict was a topic that was dual purpose for that particular presentation. And I've kept it just because it tends to catch the interest of nearly everybody who sees it on the California speaker list and all the presentations that we offer. And I started off with that presentation with the obvious, which was, what's the history of the name Eggs Benedict? Because I didn't realize that it was as complicated and we'll call it multifaceted as the main topic of the presentation being Benedict Arnold. But I had expected there would be like one simple history of the name of the breakfast, and somebody was singular would have been famous for it. But it turns out that there are quite a few ways that this became known, starting in the 1860s, and then as we progress through the 1800s and early 1900s, it didn't really become a household name until I'm guessing in 1942 when the New Yorker did a feature on the idea of this breakfast. And it was repeated again in 1967. So by the time all of us have learned to enjoy it, it had already gained its fame, but it's relatively new and it had nothing to do with Benedict Arnold. So with that, I'm going to shift into a little bit of my background. I got interested in my patriot ancestor like a lot of you, and it turned out he served for the entire war, starting from day one, responding to Paul Revere's alarm, to serving in the last unit that was disbanded at West Point in 1784. And he served continuously as an officer. And I didn't realize it, but that ended up making him serve as an officer longer in the Continental Army than George Washington. And I've been writing books about him for the last 7 years or so. And the idea was he ended up serving in a variety of campaigns, but he served with Benedict Arnold through the 77 and 78 campaigns. And the last part of my forthcoming book is dealing with the fact that he was also stationed at West Point when Arnold's treason took place, and he tried to give the place away to the British. All of my books are available on Amazon, and it's easy enough to search my name, and Or Duty in the Cause of Liberty is my website, and it's also the name of the series. And then once I finish this third book, there'll be one more that covers the Battle of Yorktown. I also, because I'm a geographer and map maker, I like to think of narratives with place as a background. And so I ended up mapping colonial America to show myself first and then my family where our ancestor had gone during the American Revolution, because he served as far north as Montreal during the we call it the Defense of Canada campaign, and he made it as far south as the Battle of Yorktown, and he was one of the few people who actually saw both British armies surrender in person. And so it was something my family had completely omitted from the oral history that got to my generation, and I don't think they know much about him, until even at the point of the 1850s. So I've been doing this work for more than 20 years, and I've somewhat known for it in the geography and cartography circles, and that led to Ken Burns's team contacting me a couple of years ago, and they had an interest in maps for their upcoming series, and in part because most of you, I think, are familiar with Ken Burns's kind of typical scene where he takes a photograph and then pans across it while the narrative is happening. and the Revolutionary War doesn't have photographs. So Ken needed something, and there's only so many pieces of art that were done in the colonial American time frame that depicted context for the Revolutionary War, the people who were involved. So we went from the idea that there might be 2 or 3 maps that they could use, and we got to the point of about 90 maps are now available throughout the film, and the film's coming out in October. Sorry, it was originally October. It's now November 16th. If you Google PBS and the American Revolution, you'll find more information about the film, and they also do kind of regional sessions with Ken and some of the authors who contributed. And I know there's one that'll be in the Seattle area on July 14th. So if you're interested, there are tickets available for that, and I think it's a good opportunity to find out what they worked on and how they've looked at presenting the American Revolution. One of the things that Ken told us when we were first seeing that, I got to see the first version of the whole thing being complete, and he said it was the most complicated topic he'd ever worked on, and that's after the Civil War and baseball. So you can get an idea that the Revolution might be quite a topic to try to do documentaries on. So, with respect to Benedict Arnold, after seeing the interactions that my ancestor might have had with him, I was kind of struck by the idea that this man just caused conflict and strife wherever he went. He was a very driven person. I didn't realize it early on, but he was from a very wealthy family in Connecticut. The family had come to North America in probably the 1630s, I think, and similar to my family. But they came with some money because they immediately purchased 5,000 acres and was trying to figure out how to put it to the best use in terms of making a profit as merchants. And Benedict was a 4th generation son of Americans, and he was the 4th of his name as well. So his great grandfather was also named Benedict Arnold. So what I was finding is that, he was motivated to make money, and he saw that the American side, and through people like John Hancock, were most likely going to be motivated for the same reasons. So he was definitely seeing his common cause with others like himself. These are later portraits, and I should say the later one on the right. He looks a bit younger in this heart engraving one, and it's quite startling to me just to kind of see the different views of the same person. And he's got the I want to be like George Washington look on the right with respect to he's American nobility is, I think, was the thing that came to mind. And I was kind of struck by just the very different ways the same person was depicted. So I got my first kind of take on some of more controversial things that Benedict had done in 1776. And I'm going to skip the 2 big events that we all know about, which are him leading an expedition into Canada from Maine, and with the intention of capturing Quebec City and the fort there from the British to keep the British off of our northern frontiers. And that was a failure, but and I'm also going to not worry about the treason that we all know about. And instead, I want to focus on these kind of smaller events that I think give some more interesting insight into who he is and what he was up to. In 1776, he was in Montreal first as a prisoner of war, but then they were released. And part of the reason is that there was a smallpox epidemic going on in Quebec, and the military governor there, Guy Carleton, just didn't want to deal with prisoners of war on top of everybody else having smallpox. And corresponding to that, the U.S. Congress had sent 3 representatives, including Benjamin Franklin, to Montreal to see if they could negotiate Quebec into the revolution on their side. That failed, but then Franklin and the others observed that the American army was in a pretty miserable state between smallpox and lack of provisions, and essentially a lack of a good plan for provisions. They ordered Arnold to seize goods in Montreal for the army instead. And Arnold did that, and it was a little bit of strife for Arnold to do it because, imagine the merchants in Montreal weren't too interested in having their goods seized and given an IOU from Congress. And at the same time, they had also noticed when Arnold was doing this that he was making notes about which goods might be good for himself, is what they thought. And I don't know if that's what he was doing, and nobody knows for sure, but he was certainly thinking about who was supposed to get which things. And then as the Americans were being run out of Canada because a large British army under Burgoyne showed up in Quebec, Quebec City, Arnold had to figure out how to get the goods out of Montreal, and he got them as far as Fort Chambly, and I'll show you a map in a moment. And it was, not it was presumed to be in the care of a Major Scott. These goods were plundered as soon as they were left outside Fort Chambly because the Americans were trying to leave. It was just a very chaotic time. So this is maybe an idea. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but Montreal's here in the upper left, and it's about a 1-day wagon trip to Fort Chambly. And they got the goods, and in fact, my patriot ancestor was one of the people as a lieutenant and quartermaster who was riding along in the wagons to take the goods to Fort Chambly. So, in my research of my ancestors, how I learned of the story. And Fort Chambly is a stone fort. It wasn't very large. It was built at a time when there weren't many cannon in North America, so it was not built strong enough to withstand a cannonade. So it was more a good place to sleep and not a great place to defend. Recently, there's been and I say recently, I learned all of this about 15 years ago, and then subsequently the Journal of American Revolution produced an article on Arnold, Hazen, and the mysterious Major Scott. So Hazen is the guy who ends up in command of the Canadian troops who fought in the Continental Army, and so there were 2 regiments. Hazen commanded one, and he was generally considered in command, the point of contact for all of them. And Hazen was the one who was suspecting Arnold was earmarking crates for himself. The one thing that the article doesn't mention, and I happen to find in the journals of the officers who were with my ancestor, is that one of the orders they got was to burn them all those goods on their retreat, so they would not be left for the British Army to inherit and make use of. So I was essentially I figured out that the proof of anything is gone because it was burned. So I thought that was an interesting thing about Arnold, though, is that he was trying to, at that point, to make a name for himself by doing the right things, even if he might not have been perfectly above board in all of his actions. Then if we fast forward a little over a year, Arnold is going to have a big role in the battles of Saratoga. And at the same time, there are some things that went on that are lesser known. And one of them is that I had learned that my ancestor's regiment, which was the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment, had gone out on the battlefield initially, and it had nearly been cut off and were almost captured en masse by the British on the field. And I was like trying to figure out what scenario must have happened to do that. The engraving here is one of Arnold. He was one of the few American officers on horseback, and he was also very notable for his courage on the battlefield, not just leading the men, but also being in the thick of the battle. So this is one of the maps that I've worked on over the years, and I wanted to understand this as I was writing my books, to figure out what was going on that might have got my ancestors' regiment stranded on the battlefield. And there's a little bit of background to this. So this is at the beginning of the battle, and what was going on here, and I'll kind of highlight a couple places here. So Dearborn and Morgan were in charge of 2 contingents that were initially sent out by Horatio Gates to scout where the British were coming. The Americans had scouts who had already upriver who had already seen that the British had marched, but they didn't know where they were going to arrive. And so Dearborn was in charge of about 250 light infantry, and Morgan had at least 500 of his riflemen with him. And so they went out, they got into a skirmish clear up here above where the 9th British Regiment is, and they were falling back. And this was the point that Arnold rode out onto the field the first time. And he came back and convinced Gates to send some troops, and the ones who were nearest to the action were just up the road here from where Cook's militia at the bottom is, and those were under Arnold's command. So the 1st New Hampshire Regiment marched first, and they were a larger regiment. They had almost 600 men, and they took the road and went straight into the field and engaged the 3 regiments that were there, and they were outnumbered by about 2 to 1 and were driven off the field. The 3rd Regiment was given its orders at the same time, but they were thinking to be smart and took a shortcut through the woods and thinking they would be traveling a lot less in terms of the distance. And it took them quite a bit longer to reach. And so the third regiment was unable to help the first regiment and joined them after the first regiment had taken quite a few casualties and had been reforming their ranks just below the creek and below the field. There's a ravine that runs through there. If you've ever been to the battlefield, there's about a 10-foot rise you can walk up, and they've got things staked out so you can see where the British troops were located. And how to put it, it's a lot cozier than this map might imply. They are right there within musket range. So what happened was that Arnold then gets back there about the time the third regiment meets up with the first regiment, and he instead orders the third regiment to go straight out onto the field like they're oriented here, and they're heading towards the left side of the 20th. And what Arnold was trying to do was he had seen these three regiments, and he knew from Dearborn that they were holding off Fraser's command, but Arnold can't see any of them, and he doesn't know how many there are or where they might be. So he figures that if the third regiment can get in here and then start pushing to the east towards the Hudson, which is on the right of the screen, the first regiment can join them, and they can isolate these three regiments and hopefully either defeat them or capture them. So, it's a pretty reasonable plan if you don't know anything else. So if you look at the idea of what is who's on the field, it's a pretty even fight if it's just those three regiments. But Arnold didn't know about the 9th, and the 9th ever actually factored in. But if I go back here and I've got the Grenadiers, they can see through these woods, and Arnold can't see them so easily. And as soon as the third regiment starts marching into the field like that, the Grenadiers are like the edge rushers of the NFL. They're the biggest guys, they're the fastest guys, and they can deal with the little guys in the regular uniform, so to speak. And they ended up flanking the 3rd New Hampshire, and I'm fairly certain the 20th Regiment came around in a pincer maneuver. And the 62nd and 21st could hold their own with the 1st New Hampshire Regiment. And that meant the 3rd was in trouble. The one thing that got the 3rd out of the mess was that their commander, a guy named Alexander Scammell, ended up also being in command of the Connecticut militia under Colonel Cook. And he had sent somebody back to get them up to help out. And my understanding, and I've verified it with the Eric Schnitzer, who is the lead historian at Saratoga National Historical Park, was that the Connecticut militia essentially got up close enough to fire into the Grenadier ranks and drive them off, and then the 3rd Regiment could retreat. So I was wondering, well, what might my ancestor have thought of Benedict Arnold's brashness to send them out there like that? And my sense is that it was probably a negative experience, given that the 3rd suffered most of their casualties at that moment, or in those moments, and they had more than a dozen men were killed in that exchange, and several were captured as well, including my ancestor was a company commander, and one of his men was captured on the field at that point. And it was, I think, quite maybe a different view of Arnold's kind of strategic genius, so to speak. And I suspect, especially after I served in the U.S. Army as an enlisted man, and I know how to put it. If things weren't going well, we complained about our officers, and I'm sure the enlisted or the private soldiers in Scammell's regiment were not too thrilled with Arnold and his boldness at that point. So if we move on a couple of weeks, the Battle of Bemis Heights was the decisive battle at Saratoga, and Arnold is a little bit of an enigma in this. It is that Gates had already replaced him with Benjamin Lincoln as the commander of the left wing. The only problem is that Lincoln wasn't in camp. He was actually retaking Fort Ticonderoga and was coming south, but hadn't arrived yet. There are a few things that happened that end up making the time frame and the timeline difficult to figure out. There is a report that Arnold didn't take the field. He was in his tent getting drunk, and basically, somebody who's writing this is trying to disparage Arnold at the time. And I don't have the sense that Arnold was out on the field immediately. Most accounts say is that it wasn't until at the point that the battle was first joined, or shortly after that Arnold actually appears on the field. Then there's this other account that I've got listed here, where Arnold actually had gotten to the field, but then one of the captains in Dearborn's regiment had apparently not moved fast enough, and Arnold ended up bonking him on the head with the butt of his saber. And at first, I was thinking, well, could that really have happened? And then eventually, I ran across an account from Lieutenant Samuel Armstrong, who was also in the same regiment as Ball, and Armstrong had assisted Ball off the battlefield because of that incident. And so there's something went on, but nobody. I mean, just like any parent that's got two kids fighting, you have no idea what happened to get them to that state, and so what do you do with them? And so, I don't know what to do in sense that, for all I know, Ball might have said something first. I mean, there's all kinds of things that may have happened. And then there's a little bit more that happens with this, and which is that Arnold he comes out of this as the army is attacking. So there are three larger forces. Torres Brigade, which is a little over 1,500. Larned is over 2,000, and Dearborn and Morgan are almost 1,000 themselves. And so they're outnumbering the British by almost 3 to 1 in their work to gather wheat from the Barber wheat field. And as they come up onto the field and begin driving the British off, it's about the time I think Arnold made his first appearance. And part of it's backed up. I've got a note here for it was Lieutenant Nathan Batchelder. He was a New Hampshire militiaman, but he had ended up helping Gates as an aide. And he wrote a letter to his wife 2 days later and described an exchange between Gates and Arnold taking place somewhere right around the D in Larned is how we described the location of where they were. So, Gates being on the battlefield was something that had been debated for 200 years. Nobody knew whether he was actually there or not, and there were plenty of dissenting opinions written after the fact that said he wasn't. And it's a big battlefield, so there's people who could have been telling the truth and saying they didn't see him, and then there were people who just didn't want to give him credit. But the other thing about Batchelor's account was that Arnold and Gates were cooperating, and the point there was that there wasn't as big a rift as people made it out to be that caused Gates to relieve him of command, because Lincoln wasn't there. Arnold had to. Somebody had to be in command of the left wing of the army, and Arnold was easily the most qualified, and he knew the men well. So what I found out next then is that the reason Arnold was talking to Gates is he wanted to get permission to take some of the Massachusetts regiments and go attack Balcarres Redoubt. And Arnold ends up leading 2 brigades over there, and they assault the redoubt unsuccessfully. And then Arnold comes back and ends up getting some of Larned's men and goes and assaults Bremen's Redoubt, where he was ultimately successful. My suspicion is that either he was meeting with Gates before the attack on Balcarres Redoubt or immediately after. It fits the timing is of Wilkinson seeing him and seeing things is possible for either one. So we don't know a great deal about the details of the sequence of action. But at the same time, it was not nearly as acrimonious as people, have wanted to make it out to be. So the other thing that happens here is that Arnold doesn't usually get credit for it, but he actually led the assaults on both redoubts, and that was one of the things that ultimately pinned the British down and kept them from combining their forces, and it ultimately led to the victory at Bremen's Redoubt. At Brennan's Redoubt, Arnold also ends up and producing the boot, so to speak. This was a statue of his boot, which is to say he was shot in the leg through the boot, and this memorial is set at that location on Saratoga National Historical Park. Here's also a recent or more recent depiction of the battle. Arnold was on his horse. I've heard different and I've read different accounts of this. This is one where he's apparently shot on the horse. I've also heard that he was shot as he was entering the redoubt itself. So there are multiple accounts for exactly when he got shot. But no doubt he got shot and his leg was in bad shape for quite some time to come, and he didn't lead anybody into battle, for the Americans at least, anytime soon after that. So then this was the last portrait I found, and it was done after the war, and I was kind of struck by the smugness of it, plus the fact that it was him wearing a British Army officer's uniform. And it's yet another completely different look to Benedict Arnold that there's common elements, but at the same time the expressions are quite striking in the sense that they're not at all the same kind of thing. And I think just the idea of this man's been depicted with so many facets of his personality on display as the artists have captured his likeness is, how to put it, I mean, most of us have seen George Washington portraits, and if you've seen one, you've seen them all. And at the same time, there's the idea that Arnold is depicted differently in every case, and it's quite a thing to notice. So with that, I'd like to wrap things up, and I think hopefully I'm in the 25-minute time frame. And I'm happy to take any questions. And there's some links if you're interested in either my website or, like I had earlier, just Google PBS and the American Revolution, and there will be the links to both the information about the films and the presentations that they're going around the country and making already. So please let me know if you have questions.
Very good, Charlie. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. Are there any questions? I have one, kind of a macro question compared to your detailed presentation. Could you explain what caused Benedict Arnold to change sides? Was it a long period of dissatisfaction of some kind? Was it an event? Could you share your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. And for anybody who's watched the Turn series on, I think it's the AMC, they do a pretty good job of, I think, capturing most of the basis for being disgruntled. But I think it happened in 3 phases. So one of the phases is being passed over for command. And he thought he should be the number 2 guy under George Washington rather than Gates, and had made that known, and he didn't get it. There was a second piece to it where he got put over Philadelphia as a garrison, and unfortunately most of his detractors also lived in Philadelphia. So that was even though he did what he wanted and took what he wanted, people there did not like him well, and it was generally a difficult time to be in Philadelphia with that kind of strife going on. And I think he having then at that point made contact with his future wife and her family, Peggy Shippen, and the Shippens were also merchants, but they were a little more oriented towards just pure profiteering during the war. They weren't going to they were going to be on the side of the winner, is what I think it boiled down to. And the Turn series puts a lot of stock in the idea that Peggy Shippen and her family had a lot more influence on him to change sides because he wasn't getting the recognition he deserved. And my sense is that he had a big ego and a lot of insecurities, so it wasn't too difficult for them to do that. And I don't know what ultimately kind of he was weighing when he did it, but the Turn series puts a lot of money on the table, and I don't think it did him any good in the long run. I don't think he got most of it, and he didn't do very well in life after that. I mean, so there's I think it's one of those things where he just made some bad decisions about who his friends were going to be, and probably should have made better friends in Philadelphia.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Well, Charlie, thank you for sharing your research, which is very impressive. It reminds me of a police detective trying to solve a mystery, and the fact you have to research so many things and resolve conflicts in information and get reinforcement for other things is truly the mark of a pure researcher to me. So thank you for sharing your talent and your results with us today. We appreciate it very much. Let's thank you.
You're welcome. And anytime I have a dozen other presentations, and I'm happy to give them. This worked very well.
Very good. You'll be hearing from us.